In the MMO genre, it is rare that a game can survive a disastrous launch, as to many players, first impressions are everything, and the game will stay as bad as their first play session no matter how much news they hear about it. Till this day, if I mention New World, there is someone who is irritated by those words, and that's just how it is. This mindset exists throughout all video games, not just MMOs, looking at games like Cyberpunk and No Man's Sky, two huge redemption stories that still have to carry some of the same negative stigma that they had post-launch, as some will never want to give these games another shot after spending their money and getting a poor experience, hindering future sales and a chance for the developers to right the wrongs that they had caused so many of these players initially. However, the case is far more severe for MMOs, as MMOs require so much investment from players and developers, so having a small player base due to a bad launch and still delivering huge updates is a risk very few of these games are willing to take. With New World being one of the biggest MMO launches in the last decade, I would really love to see it stick around, as the genre and players deserve to see some of these games thrive so more studios can delve into the tedious world of MMO development. So, is Jeff Bezos funding New World for his own enjoyment? Probably not. However, Amazon Game Studios have still held on to trying to make the game that they believe their player base wants and deserves. Despite its shortcomings for the past 2 years, it has continued to deliver content that is very well received, although not being enough to hold on to that returning player base for far too long. Partial reason being, New World is actually a really young MMO, and there are just plenty of well-established MMOs with over a decade of content for fans to sink their teeth into. However, something tells me that New World having the massive launch it did was definitely enough for New World to keep its own lights on, and with this most recent expansion, this just might be the opportunity that Amazon Game Studios needs to restore some of that lost momentum to keep the game alive and keep the players hungry for more this time. Amazon Game Studios have not wasted a second of that opportunity, and they have done an incredible job in updating and delivering the content that has made New World a unique and enjoyable MMO experience. Combining the best attributes of the genre and fusing it with its own, post-level 60 New World feels a lot like my favorite parts of Guild Wars 2 and other MMOs, with its somewhat challenging open world that encourages group play, its emphasis on exploration and discovery, its fun section PvP modes, and of course its world events. The seamless open world is also something that is very impressive to me, with each zone having its own distinctive style due to the exploration of cultural themes and time periods. As for my personal taste, the fusion between different historical periods all coming together on an island is a brilliant idea, and it allows New World so much creative freedom, while they have a great blend between realism and fantasy that a lot of people can come to appreciate. All of these things come together to make New World an impressive and immersive MMO experience, creating a living and breathing MMO world that a player can go through from end to end while having a new experience in each zone, and Amazon Game Studios have absolutely nailed this feeling. Combining lighting, music, sound design, New World is an inviting MMO world that I think you should definitely consider exploring once again or for the very first time. This game, narratively speaking, has lost me in the past, and that is something I will openly admit, as back then the story failed to deliver a thrilling and engaging action and adventure narrative, and it generally just felt like doing chores for some characters in every zone you visit. That's because the style of storytelling Amazon chose for New World is very much dependent on the player learning as much as possible about each zone's characters and their day-to-day struggles, but a lot of this exposition dumping was boring and not even voice acted all of the time, meaning that if you wanted to follow the story, you would have to read a lot of dialogue, and I mean a lot. Now, as you can imagine, this did not help in establishing any immersion for me, as I simply wasn't entertained, and by the end of it, I ended up viewing quests as experience tools and checkpoints, given they didn't really have much else to offer me. Luckily, AGS have spent some time updating and changing this experience, as it's crucial to the enjoyment of new and returning players to be interested in what they are playing from the start. By adding in more immersive dialogue and mission activities, this actually made me want to stop and listen for a change, delivering some well-needed substance here despite the story being pretty much the same info dump leveling journey through Aeturnum. I have to admit that this is a far more streamlined journey, meaning that a lot of that tedious backtracking which caused this game to be called a walking simulator is now gone, taking players to the right parts of the world at the right times. This will only become easier now that there's mounts, so players can finally spend more time progressing in the story rather than walking around the map. I feel like them adding in some new cutscenes that give insight to key plot details and developments in the game, making its plot easier to follow, is definitely the right step. But Most importantly, they have updated a lot of the gameplay within quests to be far more engaging, adding in boss fights and removing a lot of fetch quests in favor of more variety in their quests. Some of the quests can now be puzzles or boss fights or combat heavy trials. So if this is your first run through, please try and enjoy all of these new things and see if the story is for you, as you'll have a much better time doing so than older players, because this time the story made me feel satisfied, as it was enough to let me know key plot details while also letting me immerse myself in Aeturnum's open world. So I think overall AGS did an okay job in the introduction to Aeturnum, but the real standout is everything that comes after the base game's narrative. You'll definitely get more out of questing if you speak to every character and pick up and read lore pieces, as AGS has gone for a more discovery heavy style of narrative context, adding nuance to important areas and characters with a suppressed and optional level of world building that you may have missed if you had not engaged with this style of gameplay. However, it is plenty obvious that this style isn't everyone's cup of tea, and with so much to get through already, it might be too much to ask players to stop and read. Speaking of reading, almost every quest I've done in this game has voice acting, and good voice acting at that, which has its benefits like less reading, but more importantly, there are many characters with different accents and personalities which really help in giving them identity, making these story quests feel unique, which I felt was lacking in the game before. But I have to highlight that as we progress post level 60 and we look at seasonal content and DLC, this is definitely the best the narrative gets in the game, with character model cutscenes, challenging engaging boss fights, and interesting new lore details that are delivered via cutscenes this time, making Aeturnum feel like it has this deep history that we are only starting to unravel, once again keeping that theme of New World being this never-ending mystery. So I think here currently at this point they have finally started to deliver story-wise. However, these newer quests are far shorter than the base game ones, with each additional storyline coming into about 3 hours if you focus solely on the main quests, and with the DLC being about £25, this might not be worth the asking price. The base game up to Brimstone Sands is easily over 50 hours of content, so if you want to take your time and wait for a deal, that is completely understandable. New World wouldn't be New World without, well, its world. Aeturnum is primarily my main reason for playing this MMO outside of their expeditions, because it is one of the most beautiful and visually stunning worlds in the MMO genre. The grassy plains to the dark wet swamplands, the mountains to the massive desert, there is so much world in New World. And what I feel makes this even better is the style and the themes featured in each zone. New World, unlike a lot of other MMOs, doesn't have one definitive art style. There is no character that I can look up now and say this character belongs in New World, and though this may seem like a weakness, it is also one of the game's greatest strengths, as there is a seamless blend of cultures, mythologies, and time periods, leading to this world that has a detailed level of realism while still feeling overly fantastical. In New World, you can be fighting zombies or human soldiers or tree people. You can even fight the champions of ancient Rome as a Viking or a Spanish conquistador or as an Arthurian knight, and yet none of it seems out of place or too much for the world of Aeturnum. The battlefields have great swords and mages with muskets and blunderbusses. To me, my favorite looking zones are the ones that let their mythology and culture fuse together seamlessly. And the art and design team at AGS really understands how to visually impress their players, and they seem to shine their best during the game's expeditions, giving each of them a unique style and direction that really adds to your first playthrough. And I've decided not to include the best looking ones in this video, because the first time you go through an expedition is when you really appreciate what AGS are delivering the most. The game, depending on your PC, can have varying performance. I'm running at 4070 playing at only 1080p on high and very high settings, and found the game incredible to look at while being relatively stable most of the time. So if you are going in, I would say go with a 1440p monitor best if possible. That way you can really take in the sights with little impact on your performance. Speaking of the performance, the game isn't exactly what I would call well optimized, and it leaves a lot to be desired for sure on the stability side, but when it is stable, it is definitely one of the prettiest MMOs you will find at the moment. The settings also don't seem to change much in this game, and you can practically play it on low and medium and still see a lot of the good art and visuals in the game if you are having performance issues, but I do recommend high to very high if you can run this game there, because it really does look impressive. Aeturnum is massive and there is a lot to explore, and with the addition of mounts, I think you will have a much better time in doing so. The mounts have made exploration far more relaxing, as you can just set your mounts to auto run and let it follow the roads in game. I also feel as though the mounts feel surprisingly good even for New World, as the movement in this game is definitely not one of its greatest strengths, so having responsive feeling mounts is a massive win for Amazon. The mounts having their own leveling and questing systems with activities like time trials is something that New World continues to excel at, as they often offer so many different forms of gameplay and content to engage with every day, that you can be doing something very different from yesterday, and that is something that I don't see AGS getting a lot of credit for, unfortunately. The game has multiple progression paths and layers that players will get lost in as they go towards endgame. For crafters and gatherers, there are tools for each skill in the game, with each of these having their own tiers going from 1 to 5, allowing you to upgrade different aspects like the speed you mine at, or how much wood you get back from trees you cut down, or what buffs you will get from playing certain sheets of music with certain instruments. On top of this, there's systems that have a whole nother side to them. For example, the logging skill has its woodworking aspect, where you'll go back to the towns and use the woodworking station and you'll progress things in woodworking. For mining, there is the skill stone cutting and smelting for your iron, and depending on the type of player you are, this might be very boring and immersion breaking, as some missions and zones do need you to have these leveled up to interact with certain objects, but I generally find this relaxing as I can set off on my mount and go from zone to zone killing some animals to level up, or just gathering certain nodes and leveling those skills. When you are not life skilling, you are leveling up with quests and side quests, or doing faction missions to level up your faction rank. You'll take part in various expeditions, which are dungeons that have different mechanics and gear rewards and are always a lot of fun to take part in. You can also join other players in various open world activities like chest runs or portal runs, or if you are all about PvP, you can always queue up for 3v3 arena and outpost rush, allowing you to level up the PvP reward track, which you can use to progress your character's gear in all parts of the game. You can also join a company and decide to take control of a territory, or thanks to the Elysian Wilds, the most recent expansion, I have now started farming bosses for artifacts, which are essentially game-changing pieces of gear, very similar to exotics from Destiny 2. Given how rare these can be, you'll often see hordes of players lined up and killing some of these bosses in these new elite zones, so it can be very fun to take part in that as well. Fighting in New World is definitely a very unique experience, with every boss needing you to dodge and avoid attacks yourself, as you'll have to account for every animation they have, something that is not really common in this genre, aside from the occasional red circle indicating damage on the floor. This action combat allows New World to have snappy, responsive feeling combat with some actual level of challenge in there. The skills can feel a bit limited, as you only have 3 on each weapon, and of course you also have your heart rune, effectively an additional skill like an ultimate that is sat on cooldown and has to be built up. So it's not really an impressive number of things, and there's not really that much you can do with each weapon individually, but when you combo these weapons together, it opens up a lot of build variety here, and this is where roles come into the game. Unlike a lot of other MMOs, there isn't any fixed role system in New World, meaning that anyone can be a tank, anyone can be a DPS, and anybody can be a healer. You can choose your role when joining a group for an activity like expeditions. I played a tanky boy most of my playthrough and would just shield block and bash enemies in the face while holding aggro, thanks to my gems allowing me to do so. However, I wasn't limited to the shield or any weapons, and I could honestly have created a build using a different set of skills and weapons, and also queued as a tank. This allows for players to create their own builds and play the roles however they see fit, obviously with varying levels of effectiveness of course. Additionally, there are also a lot of weapons to level up, so you can play a large variety of builds, and with the addition of artifacts, it is obvious that this is an aspect of the game that AGS takes pride in, as some of the artifacts can change your entire playstyle, like having a fire staff, a weapon that scales with intelligence attributes, scale with strength on the artifact. So now tanks can be able to use fire staff and fire magic along with swords and shield builds, and that is just one of the examples of the many options that are seemingly going to be added to the game if they continue to add more of these artifacts. The enemies in this game vary from easy to annoying and then challenging. During the early days and my first playthrough of New World, there was definitely some challenge in the game, and this still exists to this day, and I love it. The boss fights have mechanics and phases that make it very easy to wipe if you're not overgeared or focused on what you're doing. While exploring, I found that grouping too many enemies would usually kill you very quickly, and not watching animation cues would result in big damage. So I love the feeling I had while leveling, and as the game evolves and you go to the higher level zones, the world becomes far more treacherous, and there's greater debuffs you can gain, or the enemies just have stronger attacks, and stuff gets really scary out there. So it's nice to have a game that is very punishing like this, and I really love engaging with the combat and the gameplay that New World has to offer me, because when I am getting stronger, I really feel it. The challenge made combat and enemy design feel better and more engaging the higher level I was, as the game was great in making me feel a level of danger in a lot of encounters, whether alone or in a group. However, the only way I felt the combat was being held back is by the game's clunky movement. For such a polished and good looking game, the movement feels very bad, and it doesn't even feel like it was meant to make it past alpha. It does suck because everything else here is really well done. They've made some changes to how the movement feels by updating the dodging animations, but I do feel as though there needs to be some kind of big change here if we're going to really polish up how the base movement of the game feels. But like I said, the combat here mostly feels great. The mechanics, builds, and roles add a nice level of challenge to it, whether you are playing by yourself or with other players. The mixing and matching of these different aspects creates a really nice MMO feeling that removes a lot of class expectation from the game, and sometimes someone else on your team can also heal, tank, or deal damage, allowing players to just have a good time. I felt like boss trials were a really good and well done challenge, having different mechanics and methods you would have to use to get past and kill these bosses. This also bleeds into how well the boss fights feel in group encounters during expeditions, as it really held up. New World's combat feels good, but is somewhat limited by stiff movement and a small number of abilities, but at no point during my time playing was I not enjoying myself, and seeing as the combat is basically what you'll mainly be doing, I feel as though it feels somewhat okay most of the time. The animations for attacks on the new weapons seem to show that AGS have taken some of that slow combat feel into account, giving us the flail and greatsword, both fast and explosive weapons in comparison to the majority. They have also gone about this with the game's enemy design, making the fights more spontaneous, and this can really help in making the game's combat that much more exciting. So I'm really hoping they continue to add more options and polish the combat features, as they really have a solid foundation here, clunky movement aside. So, is New World worth your money, and is it worth jumping back into? Well, yes. Being a paid MMO, they have given away most of these updates at no added cost. However, with their first expansion, they will be asking for a fee, which to me seems fair, as up until now they have mainly chosen to monetize off of their cosmetics in their store, and of course, like every other game these days, their season pass, allowing players to complete challenges and progress for some rewards. They do, however, sell experience boosters for leveling weapons and gathering, so you can level up these aspects faster if you are willing to pay for it. Because of this, some people have raised an eyebrow at the experience boost tokens. However, I think these can mainly be considered catch-up items at this point, as the game has been out for a while now, although this may be a negative to some players. I truly believe New World is almost a completely different game now than it was 2 years ago, and that is thanks to the commitment and effort over at Amazon in trying to fix and make up for a lot of that lost trust from their poor launch. At one point, I thought they had lost every bit of momentum for this game, and absolutely nothing would change that, but I'm happy to admit that they have proved me wrong. The only question remaining, however, is how long New World will hold on to that jump in its player base. So for those looking in from the outside, I would say get in now while you still can, as the game has never been better than this. The incredible world, the engaging new zones and updates, the variety of content for PvE and PvP players, the incredible looking visuals for an MMO, this is definitely a game that I think a fan of the genre should give a try. Well done AGS, and keep doing whatever it is you're doing, because it's working.